The journey itself was a slow unraveling, each mile peeling away the veneer of the world I knew. I had left the city's frantic pulse behind, traded its cacophony for a silence that grew heavier with every turn of the wheel. My last true touchpoint with anything resembling bustling life had been an empty airport concourse with motionless escalators, where the silence had echoed like a forgotten promise, an unnatural hush that now felt like a prelude to Oakhaven. The old pickup truck, borrowed from a colleague who had looked at me with a peculiar pity when I explained my destination, rattled and groaned over the neglected asphalt of the county road. This was the entrance to Oakhaven, the ancestral gate, and it felt less like a homecoming and more like an intrusion into a suspended dream. My grandmother's cryptic death had pulled me back. A brief, clipped call from the sheriff, a voice like gravel, had told me little beyond the fact of her passing and the necessity of my presence. There were formalities, he'd said, his tone suggesting deeper, unstated matters. I had not spoken to her in years. A chasm of silence stretched between us, wider than the miles I now traversed. Yet, a filial obligation, thin as a spider's silk, tugged me towards the funeral, towards the answers that Oakhaven, I hoped, might reluctantly yield. The town announced itself not with a flourish, but with a sigh. The trees finally receded, giving way to a vista of weathered clapboard houses, their paint faded to the color of old bone. What struck me first was the quiet, not the gentle hum of a sleeping village, but an absolute, profound stillness that pressed against my eardrums. No children's laughter, no distant barking dog, no murmur of conversation carried on the languid air. The very air felt thick, heavy with unspoken things. I steered the truck down Main Street, the tires crunching on loose gravel, a sound that seemed shockingly loud in the pervasive quiet. I saw no one, not a single soul tending a garden, sweeping a porch, or simply sitting on a bench. It was as if the town had paused, mid-breath, and forgotten to resume. A flicker of movement caught my eye, hunched and slow, emerged from the post office, a stack of letters clutched in a gnarled hand. It was an elder, the innkeeper's wife, I vaguely recalled, her face a roadmap of Oakhaven's harsh winters. I slowed the truck, a polite wave already forming in my hand. Her gaze, when it met mine, was not one of recognition, nor curiosity, nor even surprise. It was utterly blank, a flat, gray expanse. Her lips, thin and bloodless, did not curve into a smile or a greeting. She simply stared, her eyes holding an unnerving vacancy, then turned and shuffled away, her movement stiff, almost mechanical. The letters, I noticed, were all addressed to houses along Main Street, already delivered to an empty street. A prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. This wasn't the reserved welcome of a small, isolated town. This was something else. As I parked, a truck, older than mine, pulled away from the side of the building. The driver, a man with shoulders like an ox, gave me a brief, sidelong glance. His eyes, too, held that peculiar emptiness. There was no flicker of inquiry, no hint of a question as to why a stranger might be arriving in Oakhaven. Just that flat, impassive stare, then he was gone, leaving me alone in the settling dusk. I felt a subtle pressure as if the air itself was watching me, observing my every move with an ancient, patient scrutiny. The inn's front door, a heavy slab of oak, grown open before I even reached for the handle. The innkeeper stood in the threshold, a man whose face I dimly remembered from fragmented childhood summers. He was older now, his hair thin to a wispy halo, but his eyes were different. They were wide, unfocused, like pools reflecting only the sky, with no depth beneath. "Cole," he said, his voice a dry rustle, devoid of inflection. "We expected you." There was no warmth, no question, no hint of shared history, just a statement delivered with the quiet certainty of a stone. This was not the Oakhaven I remembered, nor the Oakhaven I had imagined. This was a place held in a strange, unbreakable stasis, and I, it seemed, was the only thing capable of disturbing its profound, unsettling quiet. It was not just the town observing me. It felt like the very fabric of Oakhaven, the land itself, was holding its breath. This was a place held in a strange, silent suspension, a town where the air itself seemed to hum with forgotten histories. The chill that had seeped into my bones the previous evening had only deepened, settling into my marrow. I watched the dawn creep over Oakhaven, painting the familiar peaks with an unfamiliar, muted light, and felt a profound sense of disorientation. The determined resolve I had carried into town began to fray at the edges, replaced by a nascent anxiety. The funeral was a hushed affair, sparsely attended. A handful of faces, vaguely familiar from the periphery of my childhood, gathered beneath the skeletal boughs of an ancient oak in the small cemetery. The undertaker, a stout man whose movements were as slow and deliberate as falling dust, officiated with a voice devoid of genuine solace, merely reciting words. There were no tears, no overt expressions of grief, only a quiet solemnity that felt more like resignation. It was as if a crucial element of human emotion had been carefully excised from their collective being. After the brief ceremony, a small gathering convened at the old community hall, a building that smelled faintly of damp wood and stale coffee. I moved through the room, a ghost among the living, trying to anchor myself to the past. My eyes landed on a distant cousin, a woman whose name I struggled to recall, but whose kind smile I had always cherished. "It's Cole, isn't it?" he asked, his voice soft, almost brittle. She held a cup of tea, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond my shoulder. "Yes, it's me," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. "It's been too long. I'm so sorry about Grandma." She nodded slowly. "A long life, he had a good run." "She did," I agreed, trying to coax a memory. I remember her telling me about the time she fell into Miller's Creek trying to catch frogs, and how the entire town came out to find her. He was so embarrassed, but she laughed about it for years. A peculiar stillness fell over her face. Her eyes, which had been vaguely unfocused, sharpened for a moment, then blurred again. "Miller's Creek? Oh no! Your grandmother was always terribly afraid of water. Never went near the creek, not even for a picnic. She always said it gave her a terrible chill." My breath hitched. But no, I remember it distinctly. He had a torn dress and a scraped knee, and my grandfather had to carry her home. The memory was vivid, tactile. I could almost feel the rough wool of my grandfather's coat against my cheek as he told the story. "You must be mistaken, dear," the cousin said, her voice gentle but firm. "It was the old well, you see. She fell into the old well when he was a girl. That's why she always kept the lid bolted shut." A prickle of unease traced its way up my spine. "The old well." I had no memory of a well, only the creek. I tried another tack. "And her roses. She spent hours in the garden, didn't she? Those deep crimson ones. The ones that smelled of clothes and something wild." The cousin's expression didn't change. "Roses? Your grandmother was allergic to roses. It was her hydrangeas she doted on." "Oh, mostly." I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize the discrepancies as simple misremembering after years apart. But the certainty in her voice, the almost robotic recall of details that contradicted my own, was profoundly unsettling. I drifted to another group, overhearing fragments of conversation. A stocky man, whom I recognized as the proprietor of the general store, spoke of my grandmother's stern nature, her insistence on prompt payment, her sharp tongue. Yet, I remembered her as generous to a fault, often extending credit to those in need, her voice always laced with a gentle humor. When I approached him, introducing myself, he regarded me with a vague politeness. "Cole, yes, the grandson. You're back." His eyes seemed to glide over me, not quite meeting mine. "Your grandmother was a woman of strong principles, never one to mince words, always kept a tight ledger." He was also incredibly kind. I offered, testing him. "I remember when the old barn burned down at the Peterson farm. She organized the entire town to rebuild it, even though she barely knew them." The proprietor frowned, a shallow crease appearing between his brows. "The Peterson barn? No, I don't recall that. The Peterson farm sold off its livestock years ago. Never had a barn fire. You must be thinking of the Miller place. Their barn burned down in '87, if I recall. And it was the mayor who organized the rebuild, not your grandmother. He was quite ill that year, if I remember correctly, confined to her bed." The air in the community hall grew heavy, thick with unspoken contradictions. My own memories, once so clear and defined, began to feel like fragile glass, rattling against the solid, unyielding stone of their collective recollection. I excused myself, needing air, needing space from the suffocating uniformity of their fractured recollections. I found myself walking aimlessly, the familiar streets of Oakhaven now alien underfoot. The world seemed to shimmer at the edges, my vision blurring. Suddenly, an image bloomed in my mind with startling clarity, vivid and unsettling. The vast space was silent, bathed in a sickly, fluorescent glow. Dust motes danced in the artificial light, undisturbed. There were no travelers, no announcements, no distant rumble of engines. The escalators, once conduits of movement and arrival, stood frozen, their metal teeth gleaming, leading to nowhere. It was a place of transit, yet utterly stagnant, a grand mechanism rendered useless, its purpose vanished. It was the same quiet, sterile emptiness that had permeated the funeral, the same stagnation that clung to the townsfolk's eyes. Was I losing my mind? Was the isolation of Oakhaven finally getting to me? The community hall's stale air still clung to me, a phantom weight on my lungs. The collective gaze of the townsfolk, uniform and unsettling, had left an imprint, a cold, smooth stone pressed against my skull. My grandmother's house, perched on the edge of Oakhaven where the ancient oaks began their solemn march into the forest, awaited me. Its windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from beneath heavy brows of overgrown ivy. The porch steps groaned beneath my weight, a familiar, mournful lament I hadn't heard in years. Inside, The air was thick, not with dust alone, but with the sediment of time, of unspoken words, and the faint, unsettling scent of dried lavender and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. Sunlight, muted by grimy panes, fractured into weak, watery shafts across the parlor. Every object seemed to hold its breath, hushed and expectant. Yet, it was the only place left to search, the only corner of Oakhaven that still felt tethered, however tenuously, to a past that was truly mine. I started in the study, a room my grandmother had kept locked during my rare childhood visits. The key, a tarnished brass skeleton, had been among the few items left on her bedside table. The lock clicked with a rusty protest, revealing a space crammed with forgotten things, stacks of yellowed newspapers, an archaic gramophone, and shelves overflowing with books whose titles spoke of local history and esoteric botany. The air here was even heavier, laden with the dry scent of paper and something else, a faint, metallic tang that prickled at the back of my throat. My fingers traced the spines of books, each one a silent witness, behind a particularly dense cluster of ancient tomes. Oakhaven's founding families, flora of the barren mire, and an unbound collection of local folklore. My hand brushed against something unexpected. Not wood, not paper, but a smooth, cool leather. I pulled the books aside, revealing a shallow, hidden recess in the back of the shelf. Within lay a journal. The clasp was a simple brass buckle, corroded green in places. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through me as I unfastened it. The pages were thick, handmade paper, brittle at the edges. The early entries were written in a neat, flowing hand, my grandmother's familiar script, detailing mundane observations of village life, local weather, and garden notes. But as I turned the pages, a subtle shift began. The handwriting grew less steady, the lines of text beginning to waver, sometimes slanting wildly across the page. The tone changed, too, from observational to deeply anxious. August 14th. A faint rustling in the old oaks tonight. Not when. Closer. September 3rd. The miller's boy, Thomas, saw it. Forgot his own name, almost. October 10th. The dreams have started. Not dreams, exactly. Echoes of a place without light, without sound. A vast, empty space. I feel the pull. The forgetting is real. It's a hunger. My breath hitched. My grandmother had known he had documented it. My gaze fell upon a page where the script had devolved into a frantic scrawl, punctuated by crude, jagged symbols that looked like fractured bones or broken branches. One particular symbol recurred, a circle enclosing a web of impossible geometries, twisting inward upon itself. Beneath it, in a hand that barely resembled hers, were words etched with desperate force. They steal the echoes of laughter. Oakhaven is a vessel, not a home. Our blood remembers, even when the mind forgets. The roots run deeper than the oldest stone. Our family, we were meant to guard it. Our family? What role had we played? What legacy had my grandmother left me? Beyond this crumbling house and these frantic warnings. Suddenly, the dusty study warped around me. I was no longer standing in my grandmother's study. The vast, vaulted ceiling stretched into a gray, indistinguishable haze. Rows of empty seats, designed for waiting, stood sentinel over nothing. No voices, no distant announcements, no rumble of unseen planes. Just the profound, absolute quiet of a place built for movement, now frozen, forgotten. My own breath seemed too loud, a desperate gasp against the crushing weight of absence. Then, as swiftly as it had come, the vision dissolved. I was back in the study, the journal clutched in my trembling hands, the scent of lavender and old blood returning. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden, terrifying clarity. And Oakhaven, my ancestral home, was at the heart of it all. My grandmother's legacy was not just a house, but a desperate, final warning. I had to understand what she meant before Oakhaven, and perhaps I, along with it, became another silent, forgotten space. The study, with its familiar scent of aged parchment and dust motes dancing in sunbeams, dissolved. The vast space stretched before me, a cathedral of forgotten journeys. Fluorescent lights hummed with a spectral glow, casting long, unmoving shadows from skeletal check-in desks. No bags rumbled, no voices echoed. The escalators, twin metal rivers, stood frozen, their teeth bared in a silent snarl. This was not a memory, not a dream. My own breath, ragged and loud, was the only sound in that immense, petrified space. It was the feeling of a world unremembered, a future unlived. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the vision fractured. The sterile hum gave way to the creak of old floorboards. The ozone taste dissolved, replaced by the comforting, if heavy, smell of my grandmother's study. I gasped, clutching the edge of the mahogany desk, my knuckles white. The words from the journal still swam before my eyes, accusing and terrifying. Our family? What role had we played in this slow, insidious erasure? The air in the study, which had been still, now felt charged, subtle utterly agitated. I strained my ears, but the sound did not repeat. I tried to focus on the journal again, to find answers, but the words blurred. My eyes kept darting to the periphery, convinced I saw movement. It was like trying to catch smoke, intangible and fleeing, but the impression was undeniable. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was not malicious, not aggressive, but utterly pervasive, like being submerged in a silent, observing sea. This was the entity I knew, its tendrils reaching, testing, assessing. My presence, my grandmother's final act of resistance, had stirred it. I needed to see the town again to confirm my growing fears. The journal spoke of a collective memory, a feeding. If the entity was growing stronger, its influence should be more pronounced. Stepping out into the late afternoon, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The townsfolk moved with a deliberate, almost synchronized pace, their gazes unfocused, like sleepwalkers in a waking world. I walked towards the town square, my senses heightened, searching for any anomaly. The general store, which had been bustling with the proprietor sorting produce yesterday, was now shuttered. No closed sign. I approached an old man sweeping the sidewalk in front of what used to be the bakery. His movements were slow, repetitive, his eyes fixed on the broom's rhythmic arc. "Excuse me," I began, my voice feeling strangely loud in the quiet street. "Do you know if the general store is closed for the day? I was hoping to buy some provisions." The old man paused his sweeping, his head tilting slightly. His eyes, though unfocused, held a peculiar blankness. "General store?" he murmured, his voice raspy. "There's no general store here, friend. Just the grocer down the lane." My breath hitched, but yesterday I saw a proprietor, an older woman with silver hair, arranging apples just inside the door. He frowned, a shallow ripple on his smooth brow. "No such person, no such store, not in my memory." He resumed sweeping, his movements unbroken by the exchange, as if our conversation had been merely a ripple on the surface of his consciousness, quickly smoothed away. It wasn't just that the store was gone, it was that its very existence had been erased from the old man's memory, and he didn't even register the absence. This was the entity's work, not just feeding, but consuming the fabric of reality, one forgotten detail at a time. They were not voices, but the echoing ghost of sound, like the last sighs of forgotten dreams. The uniform movements of the townsfolk, their vacant eyes, were not just a quirk. They were the terrifying manifestation of a collective mind being slowly, meticulously assimilated. It was watching, and it was hungry for more than just memories. The shopkeeper's vacant stare had etched itself into the tender skin behind my eyes, a chill that no amount of walking could dispel. His words, "no such person, no such store," echoed with a peculiar, flat finality, as if the very concept of discrepancy had been erased from his mind, leaving only a smooth, unbroken surface. The dread that had begun as a prickle now throbbed, a dull ache beneath my ribs. Oakhaven was not merely strange, it was actively unmaking itself, shedding layers of its past like dead skin, and the townsfolk were the unwitting agents of its erasure. Back in my grandma's quiet house, the journal felt like the only anchor in a sea of shifting realities. Its brittle pages, filled with her elegant, looping script, offered a fragile solace. I traced a finger over a sketch, a crude depiction of intertwining lines and spirals that resembled ancient Celtic knotwork, yet possessed a deeper, more unsettling geometry. Beneath it, a single, faded word, mill. The old mill sat on the farthest edge of town, a skeletal sentinel against the bruised sky. Each step I took was a wrestling match against the encroaching wildness, a struggle that felt both physical and metaphorical. The mill itself was a leviathan of crumbling brick and splintered wood, its immense structure leaning precariously, as if perpetually on the verge of surrender. Broken window panes gaped like empty eye sockets, reflecting the gray afternoon light with a dull, indifferent sheen. A massive wooden door, half rotted off its hinges, hung askew, offering a jagged maw into the interior. I pushed it inward, and it groaned, a sound like an ancient beast stirring from a long slumber, sending a fine powder of dust raining down. Inside, the silence was absolute, a profound, crushing stillness that swallowed the distant caw of a crow and the rustle of leaves outside. My breath hitched in my throat, a sudden tightness. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, old oil, and the indefinable odor of abandonment. Shafts of weak light speared through the broken roof and windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stagnant air, highlighting the colossal, silent machinery that dominated the space. Gears the size of wagon wheels, their teeth caked with rust, stood frozen in mid-turn. Belts, long since rotted, lay in shredded ribbons on the grimy floor. It was a graveyard of industry, a monument to a past that had simply ceased to be. I moved slowly, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the vastness. The journal was clutched in my other hand, its pages open to the drawing. I scanned the walls, the columns, the forgotten corners, searching for any pattern, any mark that matched the cryptic sketch. Deeper within the mill's cavernous expanse, past a series of rusted vats and a collapsed conveyor system, the architecture shifted. It was a jarring, incongruous change, as if a completely different structure had been grafted onto the mill's ancient bones. And there, stretching before me, was an enormous, open area, strangely devoid of the mill's typical machinery. It was vast, empty, with a high, arched ceiling that seemed to once have been adorned with lights, now only shattered bulbs hanging like dead insects. What purpose could this place have served here? Who built it, and why was it so utterly erased from memory? The motionless escalators seemed to be waiting, forever poised to carry an absent throng upwards into a departure lounge that no longer existed. My gaze swept across the curved walls of this strange concourse, searching, my grandmother's sketch burning in my mind. And then I saw it, not on the polished concrete, but beneath a thick layer of dust and grime, near the base of one of the motionless escalators, where the concrete met a section of older, rough-hewn stone. I knelt, scraping away the clinging film with my fingers. There, etched into the stone with a crude, deliberate hand, were the swirling, interlocking patterns from my grandmother's journal. They were rougher here, more primal, but unmistakably the same. These were not mere decorations. They were symbols, keys. I traced the carvings, feeling the rough edges beneath my fingertips. It was almost perfectly seamless, but a faint, hair-thin line ran vertically down its center. With renewed urgency, I pressed against it, pushed, then shoved. An awakening of something ancient, something that had slumbered beneath Oakhaven for far too long. I stood at the precipice, the journal heavy in my hand, the cold air from the depths swirling around me. I would not let Oakhaven swallow her memory, or mine. I found the entrance where the old maps hinted at a ghost of a building, a failed civic ambition from a time before the town began its slow, quiet unraveling. The vast space was swallowed by a perpetual twilight, the high windows filming over with grime and the accumulated dust of decades. Beneath the last, shattered departure board, where faded letters proclaimed Oakhaven International, your gateway to. A section of the wall had crumbled, revealing a jagged aperture. I knelt, my flashlight beam cutting a stark path into the blackness. The passage was narrow, a rough-hewn tunnel that seemed to swallow the light, drinking it deep into its unseen depths. The descent was immediate, a steep, uneven slope of packed earth and loose shale. Each step dislodged a small cascade of grit, a rattling whisper into the profound silence below. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of wet soil and a pervasive, subtle sweetness that reminded me faintly of bruised fruit left too long in the sun. It was cloying, yet strangely compelling. The passage branched, then branched again, a labyrinthine network of rough-hewn tunnels that seemed less carved than grown. The walls were not smooth rock, but a mottled, uneven surface like compacted clay or ancient, petrified wood. They were not human glyphs, but something more primal, like the scrawls of a dreaming beast. Deeper still, the tunnels opened into cavernous chambers, vast, echoing spaces that defied the logic of their creation. My light found piles of bones, not scattered haphazardly, but arranged in disturbing configurations on raised platforms of earth. They were slender, elongated, with delicate, almost avian curves, yet too large for any bird I knew. They were ancient, bleached white, and utterly still, yet their presence hummed with a forgotten purpose. They were not human, nor were they entirely animal. They were simply other. Then, the thrumming began, a low, wet pulse that vibrated through the earth beneath my feet, a rhythmic beat that seemed to resonate within my very bones. It was a sound that had no source, yet filled the entire chamber, rising and falling like a slow, deliberate breath. My light found it then, a grotesque monument to some impossible biology. Embedded in the farthest wall, where the rock seemed to weep a perpetual moisture, was a mass of undulating matter. It was a pulsating organic growth, a vast, cancerous bloom the color of bruised plums and diseased liver. It was not a fungus, nor a plant, nor any creature I could name, yet it lived. The air around it was warmer, humid, and the sickly sweet smell was overwhelming here, a suffocating perfume of decay and unnatural generation. It covered a significant portion of the wall, spreading outward like a slow-motion avalanche of corrupted flesh. Clusters of bulbous nodes, like grapes of some alien vine, quivered with a life of their own, each one exhaling a faint, phosphorescent glow that waxed and waned with the thrumming. It was anchored deep within the stone, a living tumor on the earth, drawing sustenance from some unseen source, its slow, inexorable pulse a testament to a patient, consuming hunger. This was no mere mold or underground anomaly. This was the entity, or a part of it, undeniably real, undeniably present, and utterly terrifying in its silent, relentless expansion. This was what fed on memory. This was what consumed Oakhaven. That echo now fueled a cold, hard resolve within me. Oakhaven was a wound, and I, Cole, intended to find its festering heart, the world above, with its fading sunlight and distorted memories felt impossibly distant. My light caught on a startling anomaly. Gleaming steel and polished concrete, incongruous and utterly out of place. The air here was still, thick with the scent of ozone and decay, a peculiar blend that spoke of forgotten electrical currents and the slow, inevitable reclamation by time. I moved through the concourse, my boots scuffing against the polished floor, the only sound in that vast, sepulchral space. The escalators, their steps like petrified waves, drew my gaze upwards, but the path forward lay through a gaping maw at the far end, where the concourse's artificiality bled back into raw, unworked rock. The air grew warmer, humid, carrying a faint, sweet smell like old incense or decaying blossoms, and a low resonant hum began to vibrate through the soles of my shoes. It was a sound not of machinery, but of something alive, something vast and slow like the deep thrum of the earth's own pulse. The hum intensified as I stepped through the opening, and there, arranged in concentric circles around a central, pulsing mound of the same glowing growth, were the townsfolk. Dozens of them. The baker, his flour-dusted apron replaced by clothes I didn't recognize, his usually jovial face slack. The librarian, her spectacles askew, her posture oddly rigid. Even the young woman from the general store, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. Their eyes, all of them, were vacant, wide and unseeing, yet focused on nothing specific. A uniform, profound emptiness. They sat utterly still, their bodies occasionally twitching with a faint, involuntary tremor that rippled through the collective. A quiet current ran through the gathering, a subtle, almost imperceptible exchange. Instead, it was a sensation, a faint echo in the air like the ghost of a sigh carrying 1,000 fragmented feelings. They weren't speaking, but they were sharing. Not their own distinct memories, but tiny, broken shards of what once were individual experiences, now blended and diffused, like watercolors bleeding into each other on a wet canvas. My breath hitched. This was it. This was the entity. Not a monster with teeth and claws, but a silent, consuming presence. They were feeding it. Unknowingly, their very consciousness, their distinct selves, were being siphoned, processed, reduced to raw data for this subterranean hunger. They were becoming part of a vast, silent consciousness, their individual lights dimming, merging into a single, collective glow. And then, I felt it. A soft, insidious warmth began to bloom in my chest, spreading outwards, a gentle pressure against the walls of my skull. It wasn't pain, but a profound, alluring sense of peace. Join us, it seemed to murmur. Surrender your small, frantic thoughts. Become one. Find rest. My fingers twitched, a sudden, unfamiliar lethargy creeping into my limbs. My mind, usually a torrent of questions and anxieties, felt a strange pull towards stillness, towards a quiet communion. To let go. To just be. The faces of the townsfolk, once unsettling in their emptiness, now seemed to hold a serene, enviable calm. The hum grew louder, encompassing me, drawing me in. My own distinct recollections, the memory of my grandmother's smile, the sting of her final, cryptic words, the shopkeeper's blank stare, they felt like unnecessary weight. Burdens I could simply shed. The desire to simply merge, to cease fighting, was a powerful, terrifying tide. My grandmother, her struggle, her desperate warnings. This was what she fought against. This oblivion, this erasure. My identity, my pain, my love, my rage. They were mine. To surrender them would be to betray her, to betray myself. My jaw clenched, a tremor running through me that was not part of the entity's soothing hum. I dug my nails into my palms, the sharp bite of pain a welcome anchor. I was Cole. I was here. I would not become a ghost in this silent, collective mind. Not yet. The faces of the townsfolk, once unsettling in their emptiness, now seemed harmonious, a vast, quiet choir of being. A siren song of stillness hummed in the marrow of my bones, a soft invitation to shed the cumbersome weight of self. My anxieties, those persistent, jagged shards of thought, began to smooth, to melt into the warm, encompassing balm of the collective. To let go, to just be. I felt the edges of my own mind fraying, dissolving into the vast, silent tapestry of Oakhaven. But then, a splinter, a sharp, icy shard of memory. My grandmother's fierce eyes, not peaceful, but burning with a frantic, desperate understanding. Her frantic scribblings, the desperate warnings hidden within her journals. This wasn't peace. This was erasure. This was the ultimate death, not of the body, but of the soul, of every unique thought and feeling that made me, me. A cold dread, far more potent than the lure of quietude, seized me. My limbs, heavy moments before, now thrummed with a desperate energy. The air, thick with the entity's presence, it felt suddenly suffocating. I scrambled, blindly, desperately, through the labyrinthine tunnels of the underground network. The smooth, damp stone walls pressed in, echoing with the faint, rhythmic pulse of the entity. I could feel its awareness, a patient, pervasive gaze following my frantic flight. It wasn't angry, not truly. It was merely observing, waiting for me to tire, to succumb again to its insidious lullaby. My breath rasped in my throat, each inhalation a burning ache. I imagined the collective behind me, a silent, encroaching tide of consciousness, not chasing, but simply expanding. After what felt like an eternity of desperate, clawing movement, the air shifted. It grew cooler, drier, carrying a faint, stale scent of dust and disuse. A faint, gray light bled through a distant opening. I pushed forward with renewed urgency, my muscles screaming in protest, until I burst forth into a cavernous, desolate space. The escalators, twin ribbons of metal teeth, stood frozen, leading nowhere but to a higher, equally deserted floor. Faded advertisements clung to distant walls, remnants of a world that had moved on, or perhaps been consumed. My own thoughts, fractured and raw, began to reassemble. The entity wasn't a predator in the traditional sense. It didn't consume flesh. It consumed memory, identity, the very essence of self. It wasn't about violence, but about absorption. This was the true horror, a beautiful, terrible dissolution, an eternal peace achieved through the erasure of everything that made one unique. Oakhaven wasn't dying. It was becoming a single, vast, living organism, its inhabitants merely cells in a greater, unknowable mind. My grandmother's warnings, once cryptic, now screamed with terrible clarity. She hadn't been trying to kill the entity, but to sever its connection, to free the town from its pervasive embrace. Her research, stored back at the ancestral home, held the key. It wasn't a weapon I needed, but a precise surgical tool, something to disrupt the entity's silent communion with Oakhaven. I needed to understand the precise nature of its anchor, its roots into the town's collective past, and then, somehow, to cut it. It would be a perilous journey back through the town, a gauntlet of silent, watchful eyes, but there was no other path. The alternative was to surrender, to join the harmonious chorus, and that, I now knew, was a fate far worse than any death. I would fight for Oakhaven, for the memories it had lost, and for the very idea of self. The siren song had deepened, a low, resonant thrum in the very bedrock of Oakhaven. My anxieties, those persistent, jagged shards of thought, began to soften, to round at their points, threatening to dissolve into the vast, placid lake of collective unconsciousness. But a stubborn burr, a splinter of my grandmother's fierce spirit, caught in the current of my mind. It was the memory of her furious scrawl in the journal, the weight of her unspoken warnings, the cold, stark truth of her death. I wrestled free, a gasp tearing through my chest as if I'd surfaced from a suffocating death. My eyes snapped open, the familiar gloom of the town square feeling suddenly alien, too quiet, too still. I clutched the leather-bound journal, its worn cover a rough comfort against my trembling fingers. I was not ready to surrender, not yet. My goal was clear, though the path was shrouded in a fog of dread. Find the sliver of Oakhaven that still remembered, that still fought. The shopkeeper, for instance, whose hand had twitched, almost reaching for a jar of pickled plums, a ghost of an old habit. Or the old groundskeeper, who sometimes hummed a tuneless, forgotten melody. It was a place of departure, yet here, all motion had ceased. My fingers traced the frantic entries in my grandmother's journal. Her words were a frantic mosaic of observation and cryptic lore. She spoke of the stillness, of the great forgetting, and of a core memory, a central pillar of Oakhaven's identity that, if dismantled, would unravel the town itself. What did it mean? A vibration, a memory made audible? I flipped pages, my eyes scanning for any clue, any concrete instruction. The entity fed on forgetting, on the erosion of individual thought. Therefore, its weakness must lie in the opposite, in the fierce, unyielding act of remembering. A distant, low hum began to vibrate through the floor, a subtle tremor that seemed to emanate from deep beneath the concourse. It was the entity I knew, sensing my renewed purpose, perhaps even my thoughts. And then, I saw it. A series of sketches, rough but distinct. Not symbols, but images. A twisted oak tree, its branches reaching like gnarled fingers. A small, ornate wooden box, and a circle of figures holding hands, their faces upturned toward the sky. Below it, a passage in my grandmother's looping hand, almost illegible, but one phrase stood out, underlined repeatedly. The collective echo, the song of the oldest roots, sung by those who remember what they are. It anchors the core, a ritual of memory, sung collectively. This was the resonance. This was the remembering. It wasn't just about my memories, but about stirring the latent echoes within the townsfolk. But how? How could I make them remember a song, a ritual, when their very selves were being siphoned away? I looked up, scanning the vast, empty concourse. The motionless escalators rose into the gloom like silent, useless monuments. I was one against a creeping tide, but the journal offered a glimmer. It spoke of a relic, the ornate wooden box from the sketch, imbued with the first remembrance, hidden where the roots meet the forgotten path. The first remembrance, the oldest roots. This pointed to the heart of Oakhaven, the twisted oak that stood sentinel at the edge of the old burial grounds. The box, then, must contain a fragment of that collective echo, something that could spark the dormant memories within the townsfolk, a catalyst for the ritual. The low hum intensified, a deeper vibration now, seeming to resonate within my very bones. The air grew heavier, pressing in as if the stillness itself was solidifying, pushing against my frantic thoughts. I could feel the entity's presence, closer now, a vast, hungry consciousness that resented the stirring of my resolve. It wanted me to stop, to let go, to join the quiet choir. But the journal, a physical tether to my grandmother's defiant spirit, burned in my hands. The images of the twisted oak, the wooden box, the circle of singing figures were etched into my mind. I had a direction, a desperate, fragile hope. My time was running out. The twisted oak, ancient and gnarled, stood like a petrified sentinel at the edge of the old burial grounds. Its branches, skeletal against the bruised twilight, seemed to claw at the sky, each twist a silent scream. I clutched the wooden box, its surface warm from my frantic journey, feeling the hum of the catalyst within. This was it, the oldest roots, the heart of Oakhaven. The ground beneath the oak felt soft, almost yielding, as if the earth itself had grown weary. I knelt, my fingers tracing the moss-covered roots that snaked into the soil like veins. There, where the thickest root plunged deepest, a subtle seam in the earth revealed itself, not a crack, but a deliberate opening, like a mouth. No one had ever spoken of it, no story passed down. It was a secret kept by the very land. A breath heavy and cold exhaled from the dark aperture. I hesitated, a profound unease settling in my marrow. The air here was different, thick with an odor of damp soil, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint metallic tang like old coins left to rust, mixed with the faint, sweet scent of forgotten roses. I pressed the box against my chest, its edges digging into my ribs, a small anchor against the encroaching dread. I descended into the maw. The passage was narrow, the earth pressing in on me, smelling of deep, undisturbed loam. It twisted, spiraled, then abruptly widened. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a space that defied logic. Rows of abandoned seating, their upholstery faded to a uniform gray, sat vacant, like silent witnesses to a departure that never happened. No distant rumble of engines, no hurried footsteps, no disembodied announcements. Only the profound, breathless quiet. They glimmered faintly, catching what little ambient light bled from some unseen source, a ghostly, metallic sheen. I walked forward, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished floor, each echo swallowed by the immensity of the space. This wasn't a physical place in the way Oakhaven was. This was a place within, a memory of a place, perhaps, twisted and assimilated. The air grew heady, thick with a pressure that pushed against my chest, stealing the ease from my breath. From the depths beyond the escalators, a faint luminescence began to pulse, a soft, internal throb like a distant, dying star. I moved towards it, drawn by an irresistible gravity. It filled the space beyond the escalators, a colossal, organic mass, stretching beyond my sight, its surface a swirling vortex of indistinct shapes and fleeting colors. It breathed, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that displaced the air around me, a silent gasp and sigh. The collective echo, the entity. Within its shifting surface, I saw them flickers of faces, half-formed landscapes, fragments of conversations, all dissolved and reabsorbed like dust motes caught in a sunbeam. It fed on them, not to destroy, but to become, to assimilate, a tendril of light, thin as a spider's silk, detached from the mass and reached towards me. It was not aggressive, but inquisitive, a probe of pure thought. It sought to touch my mind, to unravel the threads of my being, to draw me into its silent, eternal embrace. This catalyst was not a weapon of force, but of disruption. It contained a shard of pure, unadulterated memory, taken from a source untouched by the entity, a vibrant, singular echo of a life lived, a defiance to the collective. My grandmother's defiance. With a desperate surge of will, I tore open the box. Inside, nestled on velvet, lay a single dried rose, perfectly preserved, its petals a deep, impossible crimson. It wasn't the rose itself, but what it contained. A memory, potent and singular, of a moment of profound, individual joy and sorrow untainted. As I exposed it, the tendril of light recoiled, not in pain, but in confusion, a shudder rippling through the vast mass. The rhythmic pulsing faltered. I felt its consciousness press against mine, a surge of fragmented memories, a cacophony of lost thoughts trying to overwhelm me, to dissolve my identity before I could act. Faces flashed before my eyes. The grocer, the librarian, the mayor, their faces shifting, their eyes vacant, their memories a jumble of indistinct noise. No, I thought, pushing back with every fiber of my being. I am Cole. I remember. I focused all my intent, all my desperate will, on the crimson rose. I pictured my grandmother's face etched with fierce love and sorrow, her hands tending the rose bush. I projected that singular, sharp memory, a needlepoint of individual truth, toward the colossal entity. A wave of pure, searing mental static washed over me. My vision blurred, The concourse around me seemed to warp and ripple. It was trying to consume the memory, to absorb it, to neutralize its disruptive presence. But this memory, this catalyst, was different. It was a core of pure, unyielding self. I felt its tendrils probe deeper into my mind, seeking purchase, seeking to unravel me from the inside. It was a mental maelstrom, a terrifying assault on my very identity. My head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat behind my eyes. I felt a terrifying pull, a siren song of oblivion, promising peace in erasure. Fight it, a voice, faint but clear, echoed in my mind. It sounded like my grandmother. Remember, I gripped the rose, its dried petals surprisingly sharp against my palm. I closed my eyes, focusing on the single, potent memory, pushing it forward, a beacon of individuality against the overwhelming tide of the collective. The entity thrashed, its vast form convulsing, its light dimming, then flaring with renewed intensity. My own mind felt like it was tearing at the seams, threatening to unravel completely, to scatter my essence into the swirling, silent consciousness. I was losing myself, piece by agonizing piece. I had to plant this seed of defiance. The world, for a searing instant, was a blinding, all-consuming flame, not a fire, but a pure, concentrated thought, an agony of disillusion that clawed at the edges of my being. My body felt like a marionette whose strings had been severed, then haphazardly reattached. I gasped, a ragged sound that tore through the stillness. I lay splayed on cold, polished tile, the scent of stale air and something metallic, faintly chemical, assaulting my nostrils. My eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. Above me, a vast, arching ceiling stretched into a distant haze, punctuated by skeletal girders and recessed lights that offered no illumination. The sheer scale of the place was unsettling. Beyond them, a cavernous space opened up, lined with deserted gates, each window a black mirror reflecting the ghostly interior. The escalators, twin waterfalls of unmoving metal, climbed silently towards a higher, unseen level, their teeth frozen in an eternal ascent. No hum of electricity, no distant murmur of a PA system, no echo of hurried footsteps or rolling luggage, only the profound, unyielding quiet, broken only by the ragged cadence of my own breath. My hand still clenched the dried rose, its brittle petals now crumbling to powder between my fingers. The memory, the single potent surge of it, had been a weapon, a shard of pure individuality hurled into the vast, amorphous being. I remembered its thrashing, the violent convulsions, the sense of something ancient and immense recoiling from an unbearable pain. Had I shattered it, or merely wounded it, driven it back into its subterranean lair? A profound weariness settled over me, not just of body, but of spirit. My head throbbed, a dull ache that resonated with the phantom hum of 1,000 voices, now abruptly muted. Now its absence was a dizzying vacuum. I was no longer connected, no longer threatened by assimilation, but the severance was a wound. I stumbled towards a bank of windows, my reflection a gaunt stranger in the dim light. Oakhaven, what remained of it? Had my desperate act truly saved it, or had I merely traded one horror for another? The image of the town, nestled amidst the ancient trees, flickered in my mind, but it was overlaid with a sense of profound emptiness, like a painting whose vibrant colors had been bleached by an unseen light. When I finally made my way out, the air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of pine and damp earth. But something was different. The first person I saw was the old shopkeeper. He stood outside his store, hands clasped, staring at the empty street. His eyes, once glazed with a uniform, placid emptiness, now held a flickering light, a nascent confusion. I watched him from the cover of the general store's awning. He spoke, a low murmur, "My wife, where is she?" He looked around, his gaze darting, unfocused, then landed on a faded sign above his own door. "The general store," he read aloud, as if tasting the words for the first time. "I own this." A tremor ran through him, a jolt of recognition mingled with profound disorientation. He remembered, then forgot, then remembered again, fragments of his life surfacing like debris after a storm. The previous state had been a placid, if terrifying, uniformity. This was a cacophony of half-formed memories, a splintered mosaic of what once was. I saw others. The elder, sitting on a bench, weeping softly, not with the silent, collective grief I had witnessed before, but with a raw, personal sorrow. My son, he choked out to no one in particular. He loved the sea, but we live so far inland. A memory, perhaps, of a life he never lived, a dream he once held, now resurfacing without context. A child, clutching a worn toy, looked up at her mother, her eyes wide with a question I could almost hear. "Who are you?" asterisk. The mother's face was a mask of blankness, then a sudden, sharp intake of breath as a flicker of recognition crossed her features, only to vanish again, replaced by a bewildered frown. The identity was disrupted. The overwhelming tide had receded, but it had not left Oakhaven untouched. It had not simply released its grip. It had torn away pieces of memory, leaving jagged edges and gaping holes. Some had regained fragments, enough to know they had lost something vital, but not enough to fully grasp what. The collective memory was shattered, and with it, the very fabric of Oakhaven's identity. I'd felt the immense weight of it all. The victory was costly, the town irrevocably scarred. I had saved them from assimilation, but I had delivered them into a different kind of oblivion. A traumatic confusion that might be worse than the silent unity. My own memory, the potent rose, was a beacon, a solid anchor in the shifting sands of Oakhaven's fractured reality. But what was my role now? To stay and try to knit together the torn threads of this traumatized community? To witness the slow, agonizing process of partial recovery, of lives built on fractured foundations? Or to leave, to carry the phantom hum of that colossal entity and the echoes of Oakhaven's brokenness with me, forever haunted, but free of this dying place. The choice hung before me, heavy and unforgiving, a precipice overlooking a future I could not yet fathom.